Let me begin by relieving you of a burden many men have carried silently for years. The idea that your mind is broken is one of the most damaging beliefs you can hold, not because it is painful, but because it is false. Your mind is not defective, it is trained. And what has been trained can be understood, reshaped, and guided. Nothing inside you is malfunctioning. When a man struggles with overthinking, self-doubt, hesitation, or inner resistance, he often concludes that something is wrong with him. He looks at others who seem decisive, calm, confident, and assumes they were built differently. But the truth is far less dramatic and far more hopeful. The mind learns through repetition, experience, and survival. It adapts to what it is exposed to. And adaptation is not damage, it is intelligence at work. The mind's first priority is not happiness, it is safety. From an early age, your mind learned patterns based on what reduced pain and increased acceptance. It learned when to stay quiet, when to comply, when to anticipate problems, when to doubt itself, when to stay alert. These patterns did not emerge because you were weak, they emerged because at some point they worked. A wise man understands this and stops insulting his own intelligence. What you now call hesitation may have once prevented punishment. What you now call people-pleasing may have once preserved connection. What you now call overthinking may have once kept you prepared. These were not flaws, they were strategies. The problem is not that the mind learned them. The problem is that no one ever taught the mind when to let them go. When circumstances change and the mind keeps using outdated strategies, it feels like betrayal. But it is not betrayal. It is loyalty to an old environment that no longer exists. Your mind is not against you. It is trying to protect you with old information. This is why force never works. When you attack your mind, criticize it, or try to overpower it, you reinforce the belief that something inside you is dangerous. And the mind responds by becoming more defensive, more controlling, more anxious. The cycle deepens. A wise man does not fight what is trying to protect him. He educates it. Once you see that your patterns were learned, shame begins to loosen. Shame only survives when you believe you should have been different. Understanding reveals that you were doing the best you could with what you knew at the time. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it explains it. An explanation is the doorway to change. Your mind learned from tone, not just words. From absence, not just presence. From moments of unpredictability, criticism, pressure, or neglect. It learned what earned safety and what threatened it. None of this required trauma in the dramatic sense. Small, repeated experiences are enough to shape perception. A wise man respects the subtlety of conditioning. The mind does not forget what once kept it safe. It repeats it until it is shown a better option. And that showing does not happen through punishment. It happens through awareness. When you notice a pattern without judging it, you create space. In that space, the mind begins to relax. It realizes it is being observed, not attacked. And when the mind feels safe, it becomes flexible. Flexibility is the opposite of being broken. A broken system cannot adapt. Your mind adapts constantly. What feels like inner resistance is often the mind checking for danger. What feels like self-doubt is often the mind asking for more certainty. What feels like sabotage is often the mind trying to prevent pain it remembers. A wise man listens before he corrects. This is why understanding your history matters. Not to relive it, not to blame anyone, but to update the mind. To show it that you are no longer the person you were when those patterns formed. That you now have more strength, more choice, more capacity. The mind must be shown safety through experience, not arguments. Each time you respond differently to a familiar trigger, you teach the mind something new. Each time you stay present instead of panicking, assert instead of shrinking, pause instead of reacting, you rewrite the pattern. Slowly, gently, permanently. This is not self-improvement. It is self-realignment. A wise man does not rush this process. He knows that habits formed over years dissolve through consistency, not force. He measures progress not by perfection, but by awareness. And awareness reveals something important. The mind never wanted to betray you. It wanted to survive. When this truth settles in, the inner relationship changes. The mind stops being an enemy and becomes an ally that simply needs updated instructions. And when you stop treating your mind as broken, it stops acting like it is under threat. Your task is not to fix yourself, it is to understand yourself. And when understanding replaces judgment, the mind begins to work with you instead of against you. Let me take you a little deeper now, because this is where many men misunderstand themselves most. What you experience as self-sabotage is rarely an act of destruction. It is far more often an act of protection that has outlived its usefulness. And until this is understood, a man will keep fighting himself, believing he is his own enemy. The mind does not wake up one day and decide to ruin your life. That idea is comforting in a strange way, because it allows you to hate something inside yourself without questioning it. But wisdom asks for honesty, not comfort. And the honest truth is this: every pattern you carry was designed to help you survive something. Protection does not always look gentle. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. Sometimes it looks like procrastination. Sometimes it looks like walking away just when things begin to matter. But underneath these behaviors is not malice. It is caution that has not been updated. A wise man understands that the mind protects first and asks questions later. When you hesitate before speaking your truth, the mind is not trying to silence you. It remembers a time when speaking had consequences. When you delay starting something important, the mind is not trying to make you fail. It remembers the pain of disappointment or exposure. When you withdraw from closeness, the mind is not rejecting connection. It remembers the cost of vulnerability. These patterns were not chosen consciously. They were learned emotionally. And emotional learning does not respond to logic alone. This is why telling yourself to just stop never works. The mind does not hear commands when it senses danger. It tightens, it resists, it doubles down. What you call sabotage is often the mind saying, "Last time this hurt." Protection without context becomes limitation. A wise man does not insult this mechanism. He studies it. He asks, "What is this protecting me from?" That question alone begins to soften the pattern. Because protection that is understood no longer needs to operate in the dark. Most men believe they need more discipline, more willpower, more pressure. But pressure only convinces the mind that danger is real. And when danger feels real, protection intensifies. Force makes protection loud. Our understanding makes it quieter. Conditioned protection is loyal, not intelligent. It repeats what once worked, even when circumstances change. If avoiding conflict once kept you safe, the mind avoids it everywhere. If pleasing others once reduced rejection, the mind repeats it automatically. If staying small once prevented criticism, the mind clings to invisibility. These strategies are not evil, they are outdated. A wise man updates them instead of fighting them. Updating does not happen through confrontation, it happens through experience. The mind must learn that what was once dangerous is now survivable, and that learning happens slowly, through calm exposure, not forceful pushing. When you speak up and nothing catastrophic happens, the mind takes note. When you try and fail and still remain intact, the mind adjusts. When you set a boundary and are not abandoned, the mind learns. Each of these moments weakens old protection gently, without triggering alarm. This is why patience is power. A man who rushes his growth often re-traumatizes himself internally. He demands change without safety, and the mind responds with stronger resistance. A wise man moves at a pace that the mind can follow. Conditioned protection also explains why progress often feels uncomfortable even when it is positive. Growth activates unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliar territory always registers as risk at first. This discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is new. The mistake is interpreting discomfort as danger. A wise man expects discomfort. He does not interpret it as failure. He recognizes it as the nervous system learning. Self-sabotage loses its grip when it is seen clearly. Once you realize that the mind is not trying to stop you, but trying to shield you, hostility disappears. And when hostility disappears, cooperation becomes possible. The mind does not respond to criticism, it responds to safety. Safety does not mean avoiding challenge, it means approaching challenge with presence, with breath, with awareness, with the understanding that you can stop, adjust, and recover. A man who knows he can recover is no longer afraid to act. This is why awareness retrains the mind more effectively than force ever could. Awareness says, I see you. And being seen is what the mind has always wanted. When the mind feels seen, it stops acting out. Protection relaxes when it is acknowledged. Over time, patterns that once felt automatic begin to loosen, not because they were crushed, but because they are no longer needed. The mind chooses differently when it understands that the environment has changed. This is the moment betrayal turns into trust. A wise man does not curse his past conditioning. He thanks it for getting him here, and then he gently teaches it that here is safer than there. When you understand that what you called sabotage was actually misplaced loyalty, the war inside you ends. And when the war ends, your energy returns to you. Nothing inside you was ever trying to destroy you. It was trying to protect you the only way it knew how. Let me speak now about something most men underestimate, not because it is dramatic, but because it is quiet. The mind is trained long before a man ever realizes it is being trained, long before he has language for it, long before he can defend himself from it. Early experiences do not announce themselves as lessons, yet they shape the very way the mind relates to itself. A child does not learn through explanations, he learns through patterns. If a child's emotions are dismissed, the mind learns that feeling is unsafe. If questions are punished, the mind learns that curiosity leads to trouble. If mistakes are met with shame, the mind learns that imperfection equals danger. These lessons are not remembered as memories, they are stored as instincts, and instincts feel like truth. This is how the mind slowly learns to distrust itself, not because it is broken, but because it was taught that certain inner experiences lead to pain. The mind adapts by monitoring itself constantly. It questions impulses before they are expressed. It doubts thoughts before they are trusted. It suppresses emotions before they are felt fully. What looks like self-doubt is often self-surveillance. A wise man understands that many of his inner conflicts were inherited from environments that no longer exist. The mind learned caution because caution was once necessa. But the mind was never told when it was safe to stop being cautious, so it never stopped. Early inconsistency is especially powerful. When care, approval, or safety were unpredictable, the mind learned to stay alert. It learned to scan for signs. It learned to anticipate reactions. And anticipation, when repeated, becomes anxiety. Anxiety, when normalized, feels like personality, but it is not personality. It is conditioning. The mind does not know time the way you do. It does not know that you are older now, stronger now, more capable now. It knows patterns. And if a pattern once protected you, it will repeat it faithfully until it is updated. This is why men often judge themselves harshly for reactions that feel childish or irrational. They say, "Why am I like this?" without realizing that a younger version of them learned to be this way for a reason. A wise man does not mock the child within, he listens. The mind also learned from what was missing. Silence teaches as powerfully as words. Absence leaves instructions just as presence does. When comfort was absent, the mind learned self-reliance at the cost of vulnerability. When guidance was absent, the mind learned hyper-responsibility. When reassurance was absent, the mind learned to expect disappointment. These lessons shape inner dialogue. The voice inside becomes cautious, critical, vigilant. Not because the mind hates you, but because it learned that staying alert reduced pain. Self-distrust is often learned. Trust in the environment's unpredictability. This is why telling yourself to be confident rarely works. Confidence is not an instruction. It is the result of repeated experiences of safety. And if the mind has not experienced safety around expression, risk, or emotion, it will not trust encouragement alone. A wise man understands that retraining the mind requires patience and evidence, not pressure. Early experiences also taught the mind how to interpret others. If approval was conditional, the mind learned to perform. If love was withdrawn, the mind learned to please. If anger was explosive, the mind learned avoidance. These strategies later turn inward. The mind begins performing for itself, pleasing imagined standards, avoiding its own emotions. The mind becomes both the child and the environment. This is why some men feel constantly evaluated by themselves. The critic inside is not evil, it is familiar. It sounds like authority because it once was. A wise man recognizes the origin of the voice before obeying it. When early experiences trained the mind to distrust its impulses, the man grows up second-guessing himself. Decisions feel heavy, choices feel risky, action feels loaded with consequence. Not because the stakes are high, but because the nervous system is still operating under old rules. The tragedy is not that the mind learned these rules. The tragedy is that no one ever taught it that the rules had changed. Understanding this removes shame. Shame solves when context appears. A man stops asking, "What's wrong with me?" and starts asking, "What happened that taught me this?" That question is not about blame, it is about clarity. Clarity allows compassion. Compassion allows cooperation. And cooperation is how retraining begins. When a man meets his old patterns with respect instead of disgust, the mind relaxes. It stops defending itself. And when defense drops, learning begins. This is not about living in the past. It is about freeing the present from the past's instructions. A wise man does not rush to erase old conditioning. He understands that it once served him. He thanks it for its service. And then he gently shows it that he can now handle what once felt dangerous. Each moment of calm presence updates the mind. Each moment of self-trust rewrites a rule. Each moment of expression without punishment loosens the grip of old lessons. The mind does not need to be forced into trust. It needs to be shown consistency. And slowly, quietly, loyalty returns inward. The mind stops questioning every impulse. It stops bracing against itself. It stops standing guard where no threat exists. When a man understands how early experiences trained his mind to distrust itself, he stops taking that distrust personally. And in that understanding, the mind finally begins to rest. Let me take you deeper now, to the place where betrayal feels most personal, because it sounds like your own voice. Most men believe their thoughts are facts. They believe the voice in their head is truth speaking plainly. But a wise man learns this slowly and painfully. The mind does not speak with wisdom by default. It speaks with habit. What you hear inside is not who you are. It is what you were taught to repeat. The inner voice is trained through repetition. Every criticism you absorb without defense, every comparison you accepted as valid, every moment you silence yourself to keep peace, those moments left echoes. Over time, the echoes form sentences. The sentences form narratives, and eventually, the narratives felt like identity. This is where the mind appears to betray you most convincingly. It uses your own language. It uses your own tone. It says, "I'm just being realistic," when in truth it is being familiar. Familiar with doubt, familiar with caution, familiar with shrinking. A wise man understands that the mind often confuses familiarity with safety. The inner dialogue that undermines you was not created to destroy you. It was created to keep you within boundaries that once reduced risk. If you stayed small, you avoided attention. If you stayed quiet, you avoided conflict. If you doubted yourself, you delayed action and postponed failure. The mind learned these patterns because at one time they worked, but what once protected you now imprisons you. The problem is not that the voice exists. The problem is that you believe it without question. You assume that because a thought is loud, it must be true. Because it is persistent, it must be accurate. But repetition does not create truth. It creates grooves. The mind runs on grooves until someone interrupts the pattern. Most men try to silence the inner voice. They fight it. They argue with it. They shame themselves for having it. And in doing so, they strengthen it. Resistance gives it importance. Conflict gives it energy. A wise man does something different. He listens without obedience. He notices the tone. He notices the timing. He notices when the voice appears, usually right before growth, right before risk, right before expression. That timing reveals its purpose. The voice is not there to guide you forward, it is there to pull you back to the known. The mind betrays you only when you confuse warning with wisdom. Self-talk shaped by fear always speaks in absolutes. Always. You always fail. This will never work. You're not that kind of person. Wisdom never speaks this way. Wisdom is precise. Fear is dramatic. A wise man learns to distinguish between the two. He does not try to replace the voice with positive affirmations. That is too shallow. The mind does not trust words that contradict lived experience. Instead, he questions the authority of the voice. He asks, when did I learn to speak to myself this way? And in that question, distance appears. Distance creates choice. Once you realize the voice was trained, you realize it can be retrained. But retraining does not come from force. It comes from consistency. Each time you act despite the voice and survive, the voice weakens. Each time you speak despite the warning and are not destroyed, the narrative loosens. The mind learns through evidence, not motivation. Another betrayal comes from interpretation. The mind interprets neutral events as personal threats. Silence becomes rejection. Feedback becomes attack. Delay becomes failure. The mind fills gaps with old conclusions, not because the present demands it, but because the past taught it to expect it. A wise man pauses before believing his interpretation. He understands that perception is shaped by expectation, and expectation is shaped by history. When you expect harm, you perceive danger, even in calm moments. The mind is not broken for doing this. It is efficient. It would rather be wrong than surprised. This is why clarity is more powerful than strength. Strength fights the thought. Clarity sees through it. When a man gains clarity, the voice inside begins to change its tone. Not immediately, but gradually. Because clarity removes urgency. Urgency is the fuel of inner sabotage. The mind also betrays through comparison. It measures you against imagined standards. It shows you edited versions of others and raw footage of yourself. This comparison keeps you chasing approval instead of alignment. The mind learned this from environments where worth was conditional. A wise man stops asking, how do I measure up? And starts asking, is this true for me? That shift changes everything. As long as the inner voice defines reality, you will live reactively. When you learn to observe the voice instead of obeying it, you reclaim authorship. The mind stops being a courtroom where you are constantly on trial. It becomes a tool, and here's the quiet truth most men never hear. The mind does not need to be silenced to stop betraying you. It needs to be understood. Understanding removes fear. Fear fuels sabotage. When fear fades, cooperation begins. You stop trying to dominate your mind. You start leading it. And when a man leads his own mind with patience and clarity, the voice that once betrayed him becomes quieter, softer, and eventually supportive. Because the mind was never your enemy. It was just following instructions that were never updated. Let me speak now about the quietest form of betrayal, the one that hides behind discipline, logic, and even self-improvement. This is the moment when the mind convinces you that control is the same as mastery, and suppression is the same as strength. Many men believe they must dominate their inner world. They try to force thoughts away, numb emotions, override instincts. They believe that if they can just become harder, colder, more controlled, the chaos inside will finally disappear. But this belief itself is another lesson the mind learned too early and too well. The mind was taught that feeling deeply is dangerous, so it learned to shut things down. It learned to intellectualize pain instead of processing it. It learned to stay busy instead of staying present. It learned to call avoidance focus and repression discipline. And this is where the betrayal becomes subtle. Because from the outside, it looks like strength. From the inside, it feels like emptiness. A wise man understands that control without understanding always turns inward as self-punishment. When you suppress a thought, it does not disappear. It waits. When you suppress an emotion, it does not weaken. It deepens. The mind keeps a record of everything you refuse to feel. and one day it collects the debt. This is why so many men feel exhausted without knowing why. They are not tired from effort. They are tired from resistance. Resistance consumes more energy than action ever will. The mind betrays you here by promising relief through numbness. It whispers, just don't think about it. Just push through. Just ignore it. And for a while, that works. Until it doesn't. Until the body tightens. Until sleep becomes shallow. Until irritation replaces calm. Until motivation collapses without warning. A wise man learns to notice when control turns into disconnection. He understands that clarity does not come from forcing silence, but from allowing presence. You cannot hear what is true while you are busy pushing everything away. Suppression blurs perception. Acceptance sharpens it. This does not mean indulging every thought or drowning in emotion. It means allowing information to surface. CE without judgment. Emotions are signals, not commands. Thoughts are suggestions, not orders. When you stop fighting their existence, you gain the freedom to choose your response. The mind was never meant to be a cage. It was meant to be a lens. Another way the mind betrays is by turning healing into another performance. It convinces you that you must fix yourself to be worthy, that rest must be earned, that peace must be deserved. So even self-growth becomes another arena for self-criticism. A wise man sees through this immediately. He understands that you do not heal by proving anything. You heal by listening. The moment you stop treating yourself as a problem to be solved, your nervous system begins to relax. And when the nervous system relaxes, the mind stops scanning for threats. That is when real clarity emerges. You cannot think your way into safety. You must feel your way there. The mind also betrays you by confusing productivity with purpose. It keeps you moving so you do not have to feel. It fills your calendar so you do not have to listen. It rewards motion and punishes stillness. But stillness is where truth waits. A wise man practices stillness not as laziness but as courage, because in stillness the old voices speak, the buried fears surface, the forgotten desires whisper again. And this can feel uncomfortable, but discomfort is not danger. It is information. When you stop running from discomfort, it loses its power to control you. Another subtle betrayal happens when the mind frames vulnerability as weakness. It convinces you that showing uncertainty will diminish you, that admitting fear will make you smaller, that asking for help will strip you of respect. But a wise man knows this is a lie passed down through generations of unspoken pain. Vulnerability does not weaken your presence. It grounds it. When you stop pretending to be invulnerable, your energy stops leaking through tension. People trust calm honesty more than polished armor. The mind learned to hide because hiding once kept you safe, but what once protected you now isolates you. Growth requires exposure, not reckless exposure but honest presence. When you allow yourself to be seen without performance, the mind slowly learns that connection does not equal danger, and when connection feels safe, self-betrayal loses its purpose. The final shift happens when you stop trying to win against your mind and start collaborating with it. You stop asking, how do I silence this? And start asking, what is this trying to protect? That question changes the relationship. Instead of an enemy, you see a guardian that never updated its strategy. Instead of betrayal, you see outdated loyalty. And when you respond with understanding instead of force, the mind begins to soften. It no longer needs to sabotage you to keep you safe. It begins to trust your awareness. This is the moment a man stops fighting himself. Not because everything inside is perfect, but because everything inside is finally being heard. And when a man no longer treats his inner world as a battlefield, clarity replaces control, presence replaces pressure, and the mind finally stops betraying him, because it no longer has to. Let me leave you with the final truth, the one that gathers all the others and turns them into something you can live by. The mind does not stop betraying you when you defeat it. It stops when you outgrow the version of yourself it was designed to protect. Every pattern in your mind was built for an earlier chapter of your life, a chapter where you had less power, less choice, less understanding. The mind adapted to survive that chapter. It learned caution. It learned vigilance. It learned to anticipate pain before it arrived. And it did its job well. But here is what most men never realize. Survival strategies do not automatically expire when the danger ends. So the mind keeps using old maps in new territory. It reacts to shadows as if they were threats. It tightens when it should open. It doubts when it should. Decide, not because it wants to sabotage you, but because it has not been shown a safer way yet. A wise man does not shame himself for this. He recognizes the intelligence behind it. And recognition dissolves resentment. The final shift happens when you stop identifying with every thought that passes through you. You begin to see thoughts as weather, not identity. Some are loud storms. Some are passing clouds. Some are old patterns replaying themselves out of habit. None of them define the sky. You are the awareness that notices them. This distinction is subtle, but it is everything. The moment you stop saying, "I am this thought," and start saying, "I am aware of this thought," space appears, and in that space, choice is born. Choice is the end of betrayal, because betrayal only exists where there is unconsciousness. When you are unaware, the mind runs the show. When you are aware, the mind becomes an instrument. A wise man practices returning to awareness again and again, not perfectly, not constantly, but consistently. Each return weakens the old patterns. Each moment of presence retrains the system. He understands that growth is not a dramatic breakthrough. It is a quiet reorientation. The mind also stops betraying you when you align your actions with your values. Inner conflict is the breeding ground of sabotage. When what you do contradicts what you know is true, the mind fragments. Doubt increases. Self-criticism intensifies. But when your actions are aligned, the mind settles. It no longer needs to create resistance to slow you down. Alignment creates internal peace without force. A wise man asks himself simple questions. Does this choice bring me closer to who I respect? Does this action strengthen my integrity? Not in a moral sense, but in a personal one. Integrity is when your inner and outer worlds stop arguing. Another important shift is learning patience with your own process. The mind betrays most violently when you demand instant change, when you tell yourself you should be further, better, stronger by now. That pressure triggers the very patterns you are trying to escape. A wise man understands timing. He knows that the RVU system does not change through urgency. It changes through safety. And safety is built through repetition, not force. Each time you respond differently than you would have before, even slightly, the system updates. Each time you pause instead of react, the mind learns a new option exists. Each time you choose honesty over avoidance, the inner world reorganizes itself. This is slow work, and slow work lasts. The mind also stops betraying you when you stop outsourcing your authority, when you stop letting fear, comparison, or approval decide for you. When you stop asking the world who you should be. A wise man listens to guidance, but he decides from within. When your internal compass becomes stronger than external noise, the mind no longer panics. It trusts that someone is at the helm. And finally, the deepest truth, the mind does not need to become silent for you to be free. It needs to become transparent. When you can see a thought clearly, it loses its power to control you. When you can feel an emotion fully, it loses its need to escalate. When you can sit with discomfort without naming it as danger, the entire system recalibrates. Freedom is not the absence of inner noise. It is the absence of fear of that noise. A wise man does not aim for perfection. He aims for presence, and presence transforms everything it touches. So, if you remember nothing else, remember this: your mind was never broken, never evil, never against you. It was loyal to a version of you that no longer exists. And the moment you step fully into who you are now, with clarity instead of force, the mind follows your lead.